Edward Dawson, a wealthy 75-year-old man, sat alone in his opulent office, the room heavy with the weight of his success. The mahogany desk in front of him, polished to a high shine, held framed awards, stock certificates, and business accolades, reminders of a lifetime spent in the relentless pursuit of wealth and power. Despite all he had achieved, an emptiness gnawed at him, a hollow feeling that success had not been able to fill. His sharp blue eyes, once full of ambition, now reflected a sense of unease as they lingered on a single faded photograph. The photograph depicted two boys, no older than 10, grinning from ear to ear in front of a rundown barn. Edward could hardly remember the last time he had looked at this picture, yet today it seemed to call out to him. The boy on the right, with wild brown hair and a mischievous grin, was George, his best friend from childhood. The boy on the left was Edward himself, back when life was simpler and full of endless possibilities. Edward's hand trembled slightly as he picked up the photo, his mind transported back to the dusty roads of the small town where he and George grew up. They had been inseparable, two peas in a pod, sharing dreams of adventure and the promise of a future far beyond the confines of their tiny hometown. They had made a pact, a solemn promise that no matter where life took them, they would return to that old barn together when they turned 25. But life, as it often does, had other plans. Edward had been swept away by ambition, moving to the city, climbing the corporate ladder and eventually becoming one of the wealthiest men in the country. George, on the other hand, had stayed behind, living a quieter life, marrying, and raising a family in the very town where they had grown up. The promise was forgotten, buried under decades of board meetings, mergers, and acquisitions. But now, as Edward sat alone, staring at the photograph, the weight of that unfulfilled promise pressed down on him with a force he hadn't felt in years. He had promised to return, to share one last adventure with his best friend, yet he had never made the time. The sound of his office door opening snapped Edward out of his reverie. His personal assistant, a young woman in her early 30s, stood in the doorway, holding a silver tray with his afternoon tea. She placed the tray on his desk and noticed the photograph in his hand. "That's a lovely picture, Mr. Dawson," she remarked, her voice soft. Edward nodded, his gaze still fixed on the image. "It's from a long time ago," he replied, his voice distant. "Back when life was different." The assistant hesitated for a moment, sensing the somber mood. Before quietly leaving TI, Edward continued to stare at the photograph, the memories swirling in his mind. The realization that he had allowed his life to be consumed by material success, at the expense of the things that truly mattered, was a bitter pill to swallow. Suddenly, with a resolve he hadn't felt in years, Edward made a decision. He would fulfill that promise, even if it was decades too late. He would leave everything behind, all the wealth and power, to honor the memory of his friend. There was a sense of urgency now, a need to correct the wrongs of the past before it was too late. He placed the photograph back on the desk, stood up, and reached for his coat. There was no time to lose. The journey he was about to embark on was not just a trip back to his hometown. It was a journey back to the man he had once been, the man he had lost along the way. As Edward prepared to leave his office, he noticed an envelope lying on the floor near the door. It must have slipped through the mail slot earlier that day. The envelope was plain with no return address, but his name was written on it in neat, cursive handwriting. Curious, Edward picked it up and tore it open. Inside was a letter, the paper yellowed and worn as if it had been written years ago. The letter was from Sophie, George's widow. Edward's heart sank as he read the first few lines. "Dear Edward, I hope this letter finds you well. I'm writing to inform you that George passed away. Fax. I know you and George were very close as children, and he often spoke of you with great fondness, even in his final days. There was something he wanted me to give you, something he never got the chance to say." The words blurred as Edward's eyes filled with tears. George was gone. The realization hit him with a force he wasn't prepared for. The boy in the photograph, his best friend, the one person who had known him before the world changed him, was no longer in this world. Edward sank into his chair, the letter trembling in his hand. The rest of the letter detailed George's last days, how he had often spoken of the promise they had made, and how he had hoped they would one day fulfill it. Sophie had found the letter in George's belongings after his passing, but it had taken her years to find the courage to send it to Edward. At the bottom of the letter, enclosed in a small envelope, was a key to the old barn. Edward held the key tightly in his hand, the cold metal grounding him in the present. George had held on to that promise until the very end, even when Edward had forgotten. A wave of guilt washed over him, but beneath it was a determination he hadn't felt in years. He would fulfill that promise, for George, for himself, and for the boy he had once been. With renewed resolve, Edward tucked the key into his pocket, stood up, and walked out of his office, leaving behind the life he had built. There was a journey he needed to take, and it started now. The road ahead was uncertain, but for the first time in decades, Edward felt like he was heading in the right direction. The hum of the car's engine was the only sound as Edward drove down the winding country road. The landscape outside his window was familiar yet distant, a reflection of a time long gone. As the miles passed, memories began to flood his mind, pulling him back to his childhood with George. Edward could still see the two of them running through the fields, their laughter echoing through the air as they chased each other under the warm summer sun. They had been inseparable, always scheming up some new adventure or mischief. George had been the dreamer, always talking about the big things they would do one day, while Edward, though more reserved, had been swept up in his friend's boundless enthusiasm. They had spent countless hours in that old barn, their secret hideout. The musty smell of hay, the beams of sunlight streaming through the cracks in the wooden walls, the sound of the wind rustling through the nearby trees. It was all etched into Edward's memory. It was there that they had made their promise, a pact between two young boys who believed they would always be friends. But as the years passed, life had pulled them in different directions. Edward left for the city, chasing dreams of wealth and success, while George stayed behind, content with a simpler lie. Edward had always intended to return to keep that promise, but there was always something else demanding his attention. 1 year turned into 2, and before he knew it, decades had slipped away. Now, as he drove back to the town he had once called home, Edward couldn't help but wonder what his life would have been like if he had stayed. He had everything a man could want: money, power, respect. But at what cost? He had lost touch with the people who truly mattered. And now, it was too late to make. George was gone, and the promise they had made was the last connection between them. Edward's thoughts turned inward, the weight of his regrets pressing down on him. He had always prided himself on being a man of his word, yet he had failed the one person who had believed in him without question. The realization was a bitter pill to swallow, and for the first time in his life, Edward felt truly lost. As the car continued down the road, Edward allowed himself to be consumed by these memories, reliving each moment with a clarity that surprised him. It was as if the years had melted away, leaving him once again as that young boy with dreams too big for his small town. But now those dreams seemed hollow, empty reflections of a life that could have been. Edward arrived in the small town just as the sun began to dip below the horizon, casting a golden glow over the familiar streets. The town hadn't changed much in all these years. The same old buildings, the same quiet atmosphere. It was as if time had stood still here, even as Edward's life had raced forward. He pulled up in front of a modest house, the home where George and Sophie had lived. The garden out front was well kept, with vibrant flowers blooming in the fading light. As Edward stepped out of the car, he felt a knot of anxiety tighten in his chest. He hadn't seen Sophie in decades, not since George's wedding. Would she even want to see him after all this time? Taking a deep breath, Edward walked up to the door and knocked. Moments later, the door creaked open, and there stood Sophie. She was older, of course, her hair now silver, but her eyes were still the same, warm, kind, and full of life. "Edward," she said softly, her voice tinged with surprise and something else, perhaps relief. "Sophie," Edward replied, his voice catching in his throat. He hadn't realized how much he had missed these simple connections, the ties to a life he had long since left behind. Sophie stepped aside, inviting him in. The inside of the house was cozy, filled with the comforting smell of fresh-baked bread and the warmth of years of memories. Edward looked around, noticing the photographs on the walls. George and Sophie on their wedding day, their children, their grandchildren. A life full of love and happiness, so different from his own. They sat down at the kitchen table, and for a moment there was silence as they both struggled to find the right words. Finally, Sophie spoke. "I'm glad you came, Edward. George, he never stopped talking about you. Even at the end, he always believed you would come back." Edward's heart ached at her words. "I should have come sooner," he admitted, his voice thick with emotion. "I let too much time slip away." Sophie reached out and placed her hand over his. "We all have our paths, Edward. Gior. But he never lost faith in you." Edward looked into her eyes and saw the forgiveness he hadn't been able to give himself. "I'm here now," he said quietly, "to keep that promise." Sophie nodded, her expression gentle. "That's all that matters, Edward, that you're here now." As they sat together talking late into the night, Edward began to feel a sense of peace he hadn't known in years. The burden of regret was still there, but it was lighter now, shared with someone who understood. And as the night wore on, Edward realized that this journey was about more than just keeping a promise. It was about finding redemption, about reconnecting with the parts of himself he had lost along the way. As Edward continued his journey, the small town gradually faded into the background, replaced by the open road and the vast landscape of his memories. But the physical distance he put between himself and the life he had built did little to quell the turmoil within. Each mile brought him closer to the promise he had yet to fulfill, but also to the pain of confronting the years he had lost. Edward's internal struggle grew more intense with each passing day. The memories of his childhood with George were a constant companion, both a comfort and a source of profound regret. He was haunted by the realization that he had allowed the most important relationship in his life to wither away, consumed by the relentless pursuit of wealth and success. The deeper he delved into his memories, the more he questioned the choices he had made. Choices that had led him to this moment, alone on the road, with nothing but a promise to guide him. The journey itself was not without its challenges. The physical toll of travel, the unfamiliar roads, and the weariness that crept into his bones were constant reminders of his age. But it was the emotional weight of his regrets that truly tested his resolve. As he neared the old barn, the place where he and George had made their childhood pact, Edward found himself questioning whether he was truly prepared to face the past. What if the promise he was trying to keep was too little, too late? What if the redemption he sought was beyond his reach? Doubts and fears began to surface, gnawing at his confidence. He wondered if this journey was worth the pain it was causing him, if fulfilling the promise would bring him the peace he so desperately craved. The closer he got to his destination, the more the tension within him built. The memories of George, the guilt of not returning sooner, the fear of what he might find. All these emotions swirled within him, creating a storm that threatened to overwhelm him. Yet, despite the challenges, Edward pressed on. He knew that this journey was about more than just keeping a promise. It was about finding a way to reconcile with his past, to make peace with the choices he had made. The road was long and the journey was fraught with difficulties, but Edward was determined to see it through no matter the cost. As the sun dipped low in the sky, casting long shadows across the road, Edward finally arrived at the place he had been dreading and yearning to see. The old barn. It stood just as he remembered, weathered and worn but still standing. The sight of it brought a flood of emotions, a mix of nostalgia, sadness, and something else, something he couldn't quite name. Edward parked the car and stepped out, his legs shaky from the long drive. The air was cool and crisp, carrying with it the scent of earth and hay. He stood for a moment, taking it all in, before walking slowly toward the barn. Each step felt heavy, as if the weight of his regrets was pressing down on him, making it harder to move forward. Inside the barn, the light was dim, filtering through the cracks in the wooden walls. The familiar smells of dust and old wood greeted him, and for a moment Edward felt like a child again, full of dreams and boundless energy. But that feeling quickly faded, replaced by the reality of the present. In the corner of the barn, where they had once hidden their treasures and secrets, Edward saw a small wooden box. His heart pounded as he approached it, recognizing it as the place where they had stored their most precious belongings. The box was covered in dust, untouched for years, but when Edward opened it, he found a neatly folded letter on top of a few old trinkets. The letter was addressed to him, in George's familiar handwriting. Edward's hands trembled as he unfolded the paper, his heart heavy with anticipation and dread. The words on the page blurred as tears filled his eyes, but he blinked them away, determined to read what George had left for him. "Dear Edward, if you're reading this, then you've come back just as I always hoped you would. I want you to know that I never held it against you for leaving. We all have our paths to follow, and yours was always meant to lead you far from here. But there's something I never told you, something I've carried with me all these years." As Edward read on, the truth slowly unfolded. George had lived a good life, but it had not been without its hardships. After Edward left, George had struggled to key. Financial troubles had mounted, and in a moment of desperation he had taken out a loan, using the barn as collateral. But when the time came to repay the debt, George had been unable to do so, and the bank had taken the barn. The letter revealed that George had kept this secret from Edward because he didn't want to burden him. He had been too proud to ask for help, even though he knew Edward would have gladly given it. The barn, the symbol of their childhood, had been lost, but George had never let go of the hope that one day Edward would return, and they could make new memories together. The realization hit Edward like a ton of bricks. George had suffered in silence, carrying the burden alone, all while Edward had been consumed by his own pursuits. The promise they had made was more than just a pact between friends. It was a lifeline that George had held onto in his darkest moments. Edward sank to the ground, the letter clutched in his hands, the weight of his guilt and sorrow overwhelming him. But beneath the pain was a new understanding, a realization that this journey, this promise, was not just about the past, but about finding a way forward. George had believed in him, even when Edward had forgotten to believe in himself. And now, as he sat in the place where their friendship had begun, Edward knew that he couldn't let that belief die with George. With renewed resolve, Edward stood up, wiping away his tears. There was still time to keep his promise, to honor the memory of his friend, and to find the redemption he had been seeking. The journey wasn't over yet, and Edward was ready to face whatever came next. Edward stood at the entrance of the old barn, the place where he and George had once dreamed their biggest dreams. The barn was empty now, stripped of the life it once held, but the memories were still vivid in Edward's mind. Every corner of this place was a reminder of the boy he had been, the boy who had believed in promises and forever friendships. The weight of the journey, the years of regret, and the lost time bore down on him as he stepped inside. The barn was quiet, save for the soft creak of the wooden floor beneath his feet. Edward's heart pounded in his chest as he walked toward the center of the room, where they had once stood together, making plans for a future that never came to be. He reached into his pocket and pulled out the key that Sophie had given him, the key to the barn that George had kept all those years. Holding it in his hand, Edward felt the full force of his regrets. The key was a symbol of the promise he had failed to keep, a tangible reminder of the friend he had let down. Edward's thoughts were a tumultuous mix of emotions: grief, guilt, and a deep sense of loss. He had come here to fulfill a promise, but now that he was here, he realized that the promise was more than just a vow between two friends. It was a connection to a time in his life when things were simpler, when friendship meant everything, and when he had believed that nothing could break the bond between him and George. But life had proven otherwise. Edward had allowed the pressures of success to pull him away from the people who mattered most. Now, as he stood in the place where their friendship had been forged, he knew that he couldn't change the past. He couldn't undo the choices he had made, the time he had lost. But he could honor George's memory in the best way he knew how. With a deep breath, Edward placed the key on the ground at the center of the barn. It felt like a final gesture, a way of acknowledging the weight of the promise and the reality that he had failed to keep it. But as the key left his hand, a sense of release wah. This was not about what he hadn't done. It was about what he could do now. Edward closed his eyes and, for the first time in years, allowed himself to feel the full spectrum of emotions that he had kept buried for so long. He thought of George, of the life he had lived, of the friendship they had shared. And in that moment, Edward realized that keeping the promise wasn't just about fulfilling a vow. It was about finding peace with the past and allowing himself to move forward. The next morning, Edward awoke with a sense of clarity he hadn't felt in years. The weight on his chest had lifted, replaced by a quiet determination to do right by George, even if it was in a way neither of them had expected. He knew now that the promise wasn't about returning to the past, but about honoring the present and the future. Edward spent the day cleaning up the barn, sweeping away the dust and debris that had accumulated over the years. It was a small act, but it felt significant, a way of showing that this place and the memories it held still mattered. As he worked, he thought of George, imagining him standing there, smiling that mischievous smile that had always been his trademark. By the time the sun began to set, the barn looked as it had in their youth. Simple, clean, and full of possibilities. Edward stood in the doorway looking out at the fields beyond and felt a deep sense of peace settle over him. He had done what he could, and that was enough. Before leaving, Edward placed a small plaque on the wall of the barn. It was a simple wooden sign, engraved with the words, "In memory of George, a promise kept." It was a small gesture, but it felt right. This was a place that had meant everything to them as boys, and now it was a place where Edward could come to remember the friend he had lost. As he stepped outside, the sky was painted in hues of orange and pink, the sun setting on another day. Edward took one last look at the barn, a smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. He had come here seeking redemption, and in a way, he had found it. Not by erasing the past, but by accepting it, by making peace with the choices he had made, and honoring the memory of his friend. With a final deep breath, Edward turned and walked away from the barn. The road ahead was still uncertain, but for the first time in a long while, Edward felt ready to face whatever time he had left with a renewed send. He had kept his promise, not in the way he had originally intended, but in a way that mattered just as much. As he drove away, the barn growing smaller in his rearview mirror, Edward felt a sense of closure. The journey he had embarked on had been one of redemption, but it had also been about reconnecting with the parts of himself he had lost along the way. And as he left the place where he had kept his promise, Edward knew that he was leaving with something far more valuable than wealth or success. He was leaving with peace. If you enjoyed this story, make sure to subscribe and leave a comment below. I love hearing your thoughts and feedback. What did you think about Edward's journey? How do you feel about promises and redemption? Let's discuss in the comments.